Good evening, everybody. Hello. I just have to tell you, I just went to feed the cats and I picked up a mug which I thought was full of cat biscuits. It was actually my tea. So poured that out into their bowls. They were not very impressed, and they're still not looking very impressed. But anyway, as you may have guessed from that music, which I hope you could hear, that was the finale of Beethoven's Second Symphony. And today I want to talk about Beethoven for obvious reasons, very much in the news. Obviously, people are celebrating the 250th anniversary of his birth at the moment, and there's all kinds of stuff going on about Beethoven. And it's just, I think, a good opportunity just to reacquaint ourselves with some of the amazing features of this gigantic composer that to some extent we're all very familiar with, but at the same time there's always so much more to learn about Beethoven and his music, and there's always so much more to be got out of listening to his music and studying his music. First of all, what I'd say about Beethoven is that he is, to all intents and purposes, a kind of ordinary person. He represents the ordinary man, as it were. He wasn't connected with aristocracy, he didn't have fancy jobs, paid him lots of money. He wasn't attached to the church or any other kind of institution. He was, as it were, a freelance musician, making his living from what he could do in terms of composing, performing, a bit of teaching, and so forth. That in itself makes him a very special composer given in the whole history and development of Western music. When you then add in his disability, of course, it becomes even more remarkable what he achieved and the way in which he achieved it. And it's also true, I think, even more important than any of that is what he contributed to the history of music itself, the way in which music developed and transformed from the beginnings of the 18th century into what we now think of as a period of Romanticism. All the major Romantic composers, the Schuberts, the Schumanns, the Chopins, the Brahms, the Liszt, the Wagner, everybody who came in the 19th century owed a huge debt really to Beethoven and his ideas at the start of the century, transforming music in every possible direction. So just to clarify then, at the end of the 18th century, obviously music had been very much dominated by the music of the classical period, Haydn, Mozart in particular, and everything was beautiful. It was all about the aesthetics of the music. It had to be gracious and beautiful and have wonderful sustained melodies and wonderfully rich harmonic accompaniments, but nothing too extreme. Of course, there are loads of examples where even Mozart and Haydn were starting to produce a feeling of pushing at the box. In other words, to try and push the music forwards into a new field, but nothing like what Beethoven did. So when Beethoven inherited the aesthetic and the style of Haydn in particular, he literally encompassed it, he grasped it, he took it as if it were his own. And it's interesting to note that Beethoven didn't write a single symphony until he was 30, which is actually the same amount of time that Haydn took before he wrote a symphony. Because the difference is Haydn was starting the whole process of the symphony almost from scratch. He's often referred to as the father of the symphony. He didn't exactly invent it, but he was the one who really established the instrumental symphony as we know it. The idea of having a purely instrumental form, maybe four movements, the whole construction of sonata form and all those sort of things. Haydn was very much responsible for that. And Beethoven's first two symphonies, written, as I say, when he was in his early 30s or just approaching his early 30s, really embraced everything that Haydn and Mozart had done. It's not quite Mozart and Haydn, but it's not quite Beethoven either at this stage. It's kind of an amalgamation of everything that Haydn and Mozart had contributed to the form, with a little bit of Beethoven's own personality linked in. So fascinating. And that example there from the Second Symphony, I just think is one of the most gloriously upbeat finales of any symphony in the entire repertoire. But interestingly, the Second Symphony, that same symphony that I played a bit of just now, was the first time that Beethoven introduced into a symphony the idea of the scherzo. Traditionally, as you know, the third movements of symphonies had always been minuet and trio. So a conventional, quite stately dance, very, very stylized, quite courtly. And Beethoven changed that idea. So he introduced the concept of the scherzo, which literally means a joke or a light-hearted piece. And that's what the scherzo became. From then on, really, from the Second Symphony onwards, and all the other composers pretty much thereafter always thought of their third movement of the symphony being a scherzo, a light, frothy opportunity to show off, very dynamic, often very quick, lots of fancy orchestration, all those sort of things, but a kind of almost a toccata, a moment of showing off music, really, the scherzo, which could be fun and it could be joyful and could be everything that you would want in a light-hearted orchestral piece. So the scherzo began with the Second Symphony. But thereafter, from 1804 to 1812, so in those 8 years, Beethoven wrote 6 symphonies, numbers 3 all the way through to number 8. So in that period, which is often referred to as his middle period, he had the early period, symphonies 1 and 2. Then we went into the middle period, starting with the Eroica, symphony number 3. And this was, of course, a gigantic work in all kinds of ways, not least the fact that its sheer length was something that had never been achieved before. No other piece of music had lasted as long as the Eroica Symphony without having a text. And of course, the significance of that is that if you don't have a text, you've got to have a structure that's going to stand up all on its own as a musical being, and not relying on a narrative or on a story or a liturgical text, whatever it happens to be. So although there've been very long pieces before, they'd only been as part of a narrative, a Bach passion or whatever. So this was quite a significant moment. And the fact that Beethoven then takes this idea of the symphony as not only a new musical form, a new in the sense of a new importance, an injection of maturity into the symphony. No longer was it just a kind of celebratory piece for entertainment purposes. Now it was becoming something which made a statement. It made a statement about a philosophical idea or even a political idea, or it could just be a purely artistic expression of something that was really important to the composer and would therefore translate to being really important to the listener as well. And of course, the story of the Eroica is quite well known. Beethoven was a great admirer of the French Revolution, and he was an admirer of Napoleon up until the point that Napoleon declared himself emperor. So just when he'd established this idea of power to the people and equality and all of those aspects of the French Revolution, Napoleon kind of, in Beethoven's eyes, negates all that by suddenly declaring, I am now the emperor, I'm in charge, I'm more important than everybody else. And instead of dedicating the symphony to Napoleon, he apparently scored out the dedication on the score, and instead dedicated it to the concept of the Eroica, the hero, a kind of tangible idea rather than a specific idea. And when we think of the start of the Eroica Symphony, we have this extraordinary, and this is so typical of Beethoven, this extraordinary idea where you take a simple, basically a chord. In this case, it's a chord of E flat major, and he gives the first theme to the cellos, and they simply rock up and down that E flat major chord with the upper strings simply repeating the chord. Nothing could be simpler until he does this. And just by putting those two semitones, we're back to E flat major again. But it's such a simple idea. Taking one chord, two semitones, and takes you into a completely different harmonic language. And we have to come back. And we're back in E flat major again. But it's such a pivotal moment because no symphony has started like that before, with such an obviously simple idea, but with a kind of subtle twist at the end. And it must have been a massive surprise to the audience of the time. And it's interesting to note that even at this stage, we're now talking about 1804, Beethoven had already shown signs of his deafness. Even as far as, in fact, the second symphony, there were indications of his encroaching deafness, which is going to have such a profound effect on the rest of his life. And yet at this stage, there is no kind of tragic element to it. It's still very joyful and joyous and really upbeat. And this is a good example. But when we get to the slow moment of the Eroica Symphony, here we have the famous funeral march. That very famous funeral march, which is the slow movement of the Eroica Symphony. Whether it's an indication of how he felt about Napoleon and his heroic idol not being quite what he hoped he would be, who knows? But it's quite a significant moment. Again, nothing this profound had been written before as part of a symphony. And so it goes on, not just with the Eroica, but so many of the symphonies of this middle period of Beethoven, increasingly always pushing the boundaries, always introducing new ideas. And those ideas could be one of many things. They could be structural, they could be in terms of length of the symphony or the individual movements. They could also be, and very significantly, enlarging the orchestra. Almost every symphony at this period tends to get bigger and louder. And it's no surprise, is it, given that Beethoven's disability, he wanted to be able to hear the music he was writing. And one of the ways in which he could do that was to add extra instruments to the orchestra and just create a bigger sound. I don't know whether you saw, there was a documentary series on Beethoven on BBC quite recently. And one of the things that I took out of that was that they tried an experiment to see how big the Eroica Symphony would have sounded in the space in which it was first performed, because it was quite a small space with quite a large number of players in it. And they worked out that in order to reproduce the sheer volume, the sheer intensity of the dynamic of that orchestra in that room, if you were listening to the Eroica Symphony in, say, the Barbican, you'd have to have an orchestra of about 300 players or something. I can't remember the precise number, but it was a ridiculously sized orchestra in order to make the same effect. So it just shows at the time, the audiences must have been absolutely pinned to their seats with the sheer ferocity of the sound that was coming at them. And Beethoven, of course, was pushing harder and harder to make bigger and bigger sounds. One of the things that I know that many of you will be familiar with is the Ninth Symphony, the Choral Symphony, because you've sung it. And I'm always getting people making very polite comments about it. Some people absolutely love it. Some people find it intensely challenging. And some people almost tell me that they're not a huge fan of singing the Choral Symphony of Beethoven. And I can understand that. Apart from anything else, the finale of the Ninth Symphony is a massive challenge from a singer's perspective. It requires a huge amount of vocal energy and stamina, and in some cases it's almost impossible to sing properly because it's just so quick and so demanding and all of those things. And I fully understand that. But one of the things I think we need to do in order to understand the piece and its relationship with us as musicians and us as listeners, we need to understand the concept of the climax. And of course, the finale of the Ninth Symphony is just that. It's a massive, massive climax. And that's how it's intended. That's how it was conceived. And there are different ways of thinking about a musical climax. One can think of it as an intense moment of gratification on the one hand. So you literally go straight into this massive movement, this massive moment, big blazing orchestras, notes flying everywhere, singers straining everything to get the sound out, all of that. That is one kind of interpretation of a climactic moment in musical terms. But you can also think of a climax as the culmination of a long period of preparation and musical development. And it's a bit like if you go up a mountain, Mount Snowdon or something in Wales. If you get the train, you arrive at the top quite comfortably and you step out and there you are at the summit and you can gaze around and admire the view and you have a wonderful experience at the top of the mountain and it's all wonderful, but it's not the same experience as if you'd climbed all the way up yourself on your own 2 feet. And it's a bit like that with musical climaxes. If you've been through the period of preparation and all the development and the journey of getting to that point, the net result, the end result, is so much more exciting and meaningful and wonderful in every sense when you get there, as opposed to going straight in. And I always think that one of the problems for singers when we're doing Beethoven 9 is that thought of, we've got to sit through those first 3 movements and they seem to go on forever. And then suddenly we stand up, hopefully in the right place, and we sing the Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium, and at last we're on. But we've had to go through that process. But this is what I think is so important, to register the fact that for a composer like Beethoven, getting to that point in the finale where the singing starts, it is essential to go through all the different stages of the first 3 movements. Because only in that context does it really make sense. And just to underline the fact that you need to go through this process of the first 3 movements, as you recall, Beethoven doesn't just do that, doesn't have 3 movements and then go straight in the finale. At the beginning of the finale, he actually puts little interjections, reminders of all 3 movements that you've had so far. So just underlining the fact that it's because of that material that's gone before that the big tune makes sense. And not just the tune itself, but of course the text, the Ode to Joy of Schiller, that's what's important, and the concept behind it, but also what he does with that slightly simple, almost banal tune. And this is what's so important about Beethoven, I think, that looking back on his symphonic writing as a whole, it's not just a case of the finale of the Ninth Symphony being the climax of that symphony. It is actually the climax of Beethoven's entire life, his working life, and all of his symphonies put together. So in a sense, you need to go through all of them, one after the other, to make sense of it all. And when you arrive at the Ninth Symphony and its finale, then it really starts to make sense. And if I may, I would like to encourage you to, as it were, renew your familiarity with these symphonies. Don't do it all in one go. It'll take you about 5.5 hours to listen to all 9 symphonies. But it's a wonderful project to do when you have the coming autumn nights and the dark winter evenings. Take one symphony every 2 days or whatever it is. There's some really good performances out there available. I was playing on Spotify. That was Simon Rattle with the Vienna Philharmonic. There's a complete cycle of the Beethoven symphonies. They're all really well performed. Obviously, the Vienna Philharmonic have got Beethoven in their bones. And as you know, there's not many conductors who I rate any higher than Simon Rattle. So I can warmly recommend that. But just to take each symphony as it comes and just enjoy the sheer variety of intense music making that you get, the new ideas that come crushing out of almost every movement of every symphony. I talked a bit about the Eroica. Obviously, the Fourth Symphony is not particularly well known. It's much more intimate than this massive Eroica symphony. It doesn't have quite the same majestic kind of status, but it's well worth investigating just to hear some really high quality mid-period Beethoven that not so many people know. In itself, that makes it attractive. And then, of course, you get to the great C minor Symphony number 5, which first appeared in 1808. And this, of course, has rightly, in my view, become the most well-known, the most popular symphony in the entire repertoire. And there are numerous reasons why this is the case. And I could be here all night just extolling the virtues of this extraordinary piece. But just to summarize a couple of things. First of all, one of the extraordinary moments in the Fifth Symphony is the transition from the scherzo, given all that I said about what a scherzo is and what it represents, to the end of the scherzo. He suddenly drops down to this chord of A flat major. And you have a timpani solo. Just playing that well-known Fate figure. 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, and gradually the chord drops down. And it becomes a big dominant seventh and the big. That massive C major blazing fanfare that comes right at the beginning of the finale. So he's literally, instead of having finished to the scherzo, time to cough, all that stuff, go and then have a little break and go straight into the finale, none of that. It's all linked, and it comes out of nowhere, this really subdued, almost mysterious moment where the only thing that you can really recognize is that timpani, da 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 da. And it then goes into this massive C major blazing fanfare with not just the trumpets and the horns that you would expect, but Beethoven adds 3 trombones and a piccolo and a contrabassoon. So he's added to the top of the orchestra, adding the piccolo. He's added to the bottom, having the double bassoon playing way below all the other instruments. And just to pad out the middle, to make it bigger and stronger and fatter and louder, he adds 3 trombones. This is the first time ever that trombones have been used in a symphony. And of course, it wasn't going to be the last, but inevitably, it's Beethoven, it's the first. Why hadn't trombones been used before? A couple of reasons. One is it was thought that they weren't really associated with instrumental music. Trombones were very much associated with church music with settings of the Mass and other liturgical pieces. They were quite almost unfashionable, old-fashioned instruments. One of the things, of course, they can do is to play all the notes, because if they have a slide, they had a full chromatic opportunity, whereas the trumpets and horns of Beethoven's time could only play the natural notes of the harmonic series. So they were quite restricted in what they could play, and they tended to only come in at the loud moments. And it never occurred to anybody really that you needed trombones as well. If you've got horns and you've got trumpets and you've got timpani, you've got plenty of power there. You don't need to add these rather archaic instruments as well. But Beethoven decided he needed it. He needed it for the power, he needed it for the volume, and he needed to make the impact that that start of the finale does. And of course, one of the things that we tend to overlook about Beethoven is his ability to link everything together. Whilst he's making life really interesting by adopting new ideas and new techniques and pushing the boundaries harmonically, rhythmically, melodically all the time, but then he does this crazy idea of linking the different movements. So just in a simple way, we all think of this as if it was a triplet. We think chia cha cha cha, 1 2 3 1, 1 2 3 1. But of course, it isn't a triplet. It's 3 quavers. So it's, in other words, the starting point is actually a rest. The first note of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is not a note at all. It's a rest, and it's feeling ba 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 bum. And it's that feeling of that surprise, that kind of insecurity, rhythmic insecurity. No other composer would ever have dared do that. To start a major symphony with a rest is just an extraordinary idea. It's asking for trouble. And sure enough, it's one of the hardest things to conduct in the entire repertoire. To get those 3 quavers together is really, really hard. Trust me. And it's just typical of Beethoven that he should set a simple little motive like that, such a simple idea, just 3 notes and then a long one. But it manages to convey so much intensity and so much opportunity for development. And that's what this and many other pieces of its ilk are all about. It's about what you can do with this very simple material, how you develop it, how you make it into something much larger than the opening. And I said that these ideas of cha, 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 3 short notes and a long one, comes back even in the scherzo. So just where you wouldn't really expect it. We talked about the blazing start to the finale. Which interestingly, I noticed that the London Philharmonic Orchestra, bless them, when they came together for the first time quite recently to play together in the Royal Festival Hall, what piece did they choose to play? Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Why? Because it's a piece that everybody adores, and it represents, doesn't it, hope and something that's positive and grand and a wonderful statement of intent. And it's that aspect of this piece which they felt was absolutely bang on for this particular moment in the history of an orchestra that hasn't been able to play for 6 months, and on one occasion is able to come together in a socially distanced way with the brass sitting in the seats where the audience should be and the rest of the orchestra on stage all spread out. But this was the piece that they chose. And here we have just another example of how Beethoven means so much to so many people, players, listeners, and every branch of music and culture that grew out of the period of Romanticism in the 19th century. So much of it looks back and is influenced by the extraordinary creation of Beethoven and everything that he produced. It's well worth saying that the other symphonies, perhaps less well-known symphonies, obviously everybody is very familiar with the Sixth, the Pastoral Symphony, which again was an extraordinary moment in the history and development of symphonic writing. Because here, for a start, he pushes the boundaries again, not 4 movements, but 5. And it becomes the first, what we tend to think of as a program symphony. In other words, a symphony that has an element of a program about it. It is not just music for the sake of music. It is not abstract. It has a title to each movement. And although they're quite simple ideas, sitting by a brook, a storm, a gathering of country people, that kind of thing, it's not actually telling a story. It's not actually describing a scene such as a painting would do. It's more like expressing the feel of being in the country, or expressing what it feels like to be brought up or caught out in a storm of some kind. It's that kind of element which makes the Pastoral really quite astonishing because of its ingenuity and the fact that he introduces all these extra musical ideas into what is ostensibly still a perfectly structured musical composition made up of sonata form movements and all the rest of it. So the Pastoral is well worth listening. Symphony number 7, the apotheosis of rhythm, of dance, as it's called. It has not so much dance movements about it, but it just has really lively, intense rhythms and a wonderful kind of rhythmic passion that goes from the beginning to the end of the 7th Symphony. It's bright A major tonality, which is really quite unusual, and it has an element of just sheer joyfulness and this celebration of music in general and the concept of dance and liveliness and rhythm. Just amazing stuff, and really, really worth listening to. Again, and I know you've all heard these symphonies, but just to have another listen from time to time, I think is a really good thing to do. And I can't recommend it enough. Symphony number 8, often referred to as the hymn to humor. This is an extraordinary piece. It's as if the composer was kind of, knuckling down for something that's going to be bigger, as if he needed to conserve a bit of energy. It's quite intimate. It's quite short. It doesn't even have a slow movement, a conventional slow movement. It has a scherzo and a minuet. So here's another idea. We have the modern idea of the scherzo, but at the same time, we'll have a slightly look back at a rather nostalgic minuet and do without the slow movement altogether. It's almost like a piece of chamber music. It's the composer, thinking about other things, other projects that are going to come later, and he needs to kind of clean his palette before the major works that come in his late period. And of course, the major works of Beethoven's late period include the Symphony number 9, the Missa Solemnis, Fidelio, the late quartets, the extraordinary string quartets, some of which are so off the wall, they sound more like Schoenberg than Beethoven. It's something I tend to do with my students a lot, is to play them a late Beethoven quartet and ask them to say when it was written. And they nearly always say 20th century, when of course it was actually 1825 or something. So this is the time of Beethoven's full maturity. The same applies to his late piano sonatas as well. The intensity and the sheer harmonic language in particular has just gone off the scale. And this is a period now when Beethoven was entirely deaf. He could not hear anything. He tried chopping the legs off the piano to make the soundboard resonate with the floorboards. He tried everything he could think of to get the music loud enough so he could hear it, but he was pretty much completely deaf. And it's no surprise, is it, that there was actually a 12-year gap between the 8th Symphony in 1812 and the 9th Symphony in 1824. So that 12-year period in the life of a composer like Beethoven is a massive, massive opportunity for things to happen to him, both in terms of his life and in terms of his musicality and everything else. And it's no surprise that when the 9th Symphony does appear, it is such an extraordinary piece and completely separate almost from everything that had gone before in terms of its scale and its reach and all of those things. So if we're thinking about, as my basic theme of the evening was intended to be, if we're thinking about this idea of the musical climax, it's not just a case of going into the last movement of the Beethoven's 9th Symphony and listening to that on its own. It's about what led up to it, both in terms of the symphony itself, the 3 previous movements, but also the entire output of the composer leading up to this moment. And it's only when you can really see that period of development and an intense preparation that went on from 1800 right up to 1824, that's when this climactic moment of the finale of the choral symphony, that's when it really starts to make sense. And you think, now I understand. Now I get what he was on about. This is why it is conceived in the way that it is. This is why it has become such an important, iconic moment of Western civilization, because of what's gone before, how it's prepared for, how it has developed, and how the composer, suffering as he is with this massive, massive disability, the worst kind of disability you can possibly think of for a composer or any musician, not to be able to hear a note of not only their music, but anybody else's. I mean, it just doesn't bear thinking about in terms of how that would affect you, your mental health, as we would say today. Extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. We owe so much to this amazing man. And I think we are absolutely right to celebrate as much as we possibly can. Have a nice glass of something attractive, listen to some Beethoven tonight, and just be grateful and thankful for everything that this amazing composer left to us to enjoy and to savor and to be inspired by 250 years after his birth. Sorry to rant on, but it's a wonderful subject and one very dear to my heart. So I hope a little bit of that energy and enthusiasm has come across these strange electronic forces. And I look forward to speaking to you all next week. Thank you very much. Thank you for bearing with me. And I shall hopefully see you soon. Bye for now.